NASA says that right as of now, it is an awesome essential opportunity to focus on the world Venus. This follows the new discoveries of possible life on the planet. If you end up analyzing NASA's records from the 1960s, you'd see the space organization calling Venus a planet of judgment. Meanwhile, Mars transformed into our fundamental objective. Such mindful naming of the essential planets wasn't conventional during the wild space race period. The Soviet Union was focused on sending missions to Venus. The dazzling planet showed basically no potential for life, yet the Soviet space program didn't decommission the Venera program until the fall of the USSR. In view of Neil deGrasse Tyson, we finally understand the reason why. Join us as we inspect the declassified photos from Venus taken by the Soviet Union. The fall of the Soviet Union was significant in more ways than one. Not only did it change the world's overall structure, but the breakdown of the USSR also sealed away many secrets. The reality that the Soviets had a deep inclination for keeping secrets, from running the most speedy intelligence organization on the planet to being secretive about their true limits, suggests that extraterrestrial contact was one of those privileged secrets. The former superpower holds many untold secrets. Before the US outpaced all planetary missions in space, the Soviet Union was leading the game. While the US and USSR had a long history of both successful and failed space missions, their primary focus was on the hostile planet Venus. In the Russian language, you'd see Venus as Venera, which is also the name of the mission that persevered from 1961 to 1983. During this time, the US was focused on sending its missions to the moon. In a way, the Soviets chose to use their resources elsewhere. We can't say that the whole obsession with the second planet from our sun is odd. Did the Soviets want to use the planet's surface as a potential power station? Or were they maybe hoping to colonize the planet, seeking any signs of development beneath the surface? The question remains, why were the Soviets so focused on this hostile planet as they conducted these missions during the Cold War? They weren't completely open about their goals. In fact, everything we know about the Venusian missions comes from declassified and unarchived information. After such a lot of effort pinpointing what the Soviets were actually searching for and whether they ever uncovered the secrets of Venus, we must note that the Soviets didn't land on Venus once or even twice, but regularly. That's true. The Soviets launched 28 costly rockets around the planet. Also, 13 of those entered the Venusian atmosphere, while 8 actually landed. Such complex missions put the Soviets in a leading position in space exploration. Sure, the US was a close second, but NASA was more focused on satellites and innovative technology than on searching for life on other planets. Their attention was on Mars, which in turn wasn't particularly strange or especially wrong. Your history course probably won't tell you this, but the Soviet space program was the first to send a probe into the atmosphere of a planet other than Earth. It also had another series of firsts to its name. The USSR became the first country to achieve a soft landing on another planet, returning pictures and sounds from the surface of that planet. The Soviets had their own one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind moment long before the US. So why do we only occasionally hear about such achievements? Well, remember what we said about the Soviet affinity for keeping secrets. That's only one of many reasons for the oversight of the Soviet space program. In 1992, the famous office was decommissioned following the breakdown of the USSR, and the program had to be reestablished under a new Russian identity, Roscosmos. Many of its original records were either lost or destroyed. This is precisely why we don't have an unambiguous answer regarding why the Soviets launched 28 rockets into Venus's atmosphere. Still, we can make the most reasonable presumption. Maybe the Soviet decision to explore Venus was more about cost efficiency than anything else. It's not to say that the space program didn't recognize the planet's actual potential. They were looking for reasonable water levels, sunlight, radiation, and the general characteristics of the planet. Without a series of these space missions, it would have been exceptionally challenging to assess Venus's high temperatures and thick atmosphere. Today, many astronomers don't believe that the hostile planet could support life. The temperatures there are high enough to melt lead, and water is scarce. Besides, due to its thick air, the atmospheric pressure on Venus is roughly 90 times that of Earth. At any rate, there are still ongoing advancements, and to dismiss the USSR's contribution to the investigation of Venus is to change history. As far as the Soviets were concerned, Venus was worth studying. Even though exploring other, more hospitable planets like Mars wasn't entirely impractical, it was more costly than sending probes to Venus. Everything essentially boils down to the distance from Earth to another celestial body. On average, the hostile planet is only 40 million kilometers away from our home, while Mars is, on average, 250 million kilometers away. Such vast differences in distance result in enormous differences in cost. Had the US not been the world's largest economy, it might have never even explored Mars easily. Various reports suggest that Soviet missions were dangerous and had significant technical gaps. Of course, the rockets couldn't cover immense distances, and the organization had a poor history of losing contact with its rockets. So it makes sense why the Soviet space program chose a more pragmatic and relatively closer mission that would yield results. At any rate, if we don't consider the space race in this context, the story of the Venera missions would be incomplete. The US wasn't even on the space map when the Soviet program launched the first artificial satellite, Sputnik 1, in 1957. This move began the space race and kept its momentum. What's particularly interesting is why the US focused on the Moon rather than Venus. NASA had a series of disappointments with its Venus missions during the 1960s, and thus the US Space Organization hit a diversion known as the Venus Curse. Each time they launched a probe into Venus's atmosphere, it failed. This was exactly when the Soviet Union saw an outstanding opportunity to capitalize on NASA's failures. Around that time, both the US and the USSR were determined to win the space race. The best strategy was to exploit two specific opportunities. It was a quiet yet indisputable strategy. The Soviet space program seized Earth's sister planet as its first victory in the space race, accomplishing something its rival had failed to do. No matter what, the Soviet Union's limited resources and wavering government were no match for the relentless pursuit of their space goals. They repeatedly launched missions to Venus to maintain their leading position over the US. In contrast to NASA's focus on the Moon, this key decision wasn't without ill will. Additionally, clever exposure was used to cloud their major failures with Venus. The American government was prompted to explore the USSR's focus on the planet with the media labeling Venus, the evil planet, while Mars became humanity's destiny. These names didn't matter to the Soviets. Their mission was to show their supremacy over the Americans, and they succeeded in doing so. The Venera missions are nearly forgotten in modern history, but despite their early difficulties, these missions were remarkably advanced, super innovative, and aggressive. At the start of the space age, the Venera missions led the way. Back in the 1950s, the Soviets began testing the designs and technical details of the probes. Over the next 30 years, they continued to build and launch interplanetary rockets as part of the Venera program. Since the program ran alongside the Cold War, the Soviets focused on improving their resources. Fortunately for them, the early years of the conflict gave them more resources than the US, which turned out to be incredibly important. It allowed them to build larger rockets designed to break through high altitudes and cover vast distances. The Soviets rushed to experiment with both manned and unmanned rockets, while the Soviet scientific community worked on a series of measurements and evaluations to create exact courses for the Venus missions. Behind the scenes, their Mars programs were also running. Nothing was more important than developing advanced instrumentation for these missions. This led to significant breakthroughs in the history of space exploration. In 1966, the Soviet Union launched Venera 3, making it the first artificial probe to enter the atmosphere of Venus and successfully land on the planet's surface. This accomplishment raised the competition between the two superpowers. Unlike the American missions, which were plagued by failures and accidents, the Soviet program continued to make progress. Despite their wins, the USSR managed to send successful probes into Venus's atmosphere. The main point of content with this approach was the limited design capabilities. The Soviets quickly overcame their design issues and launched the most sophisticated probes of the Venera program during the 1970s. Their pioneering efforts allowed them to achieve the first concurrent launches of Venera 4 and Venera 5. According to most history experts, this was the most extraordinary decade in the history of space exploration. Surely, the US tried to develop similar launch methods. So why did the Soviet program choose concurrent launches into Venus? To understand this, you need to recognize that interplanetary travel requires advanced instrumentation to gather the highest level of data and evidence. The probes were initially launched to study the planet's surface, and that's exactly what happened with Venera. Since the launch went perfectly, the probe successfully entered Venus's atmosphere. The Soviet program continued with Venera 5, but this wasn't simply a repeat of the first launch. The second probe was specifically designed to gather detailed information about the planet. Ultimately, Venera 7, the last successful launch, made history by being the first spacecraft to land successfully on Venus. The entire mission represented an intense rivalry between the Soviet Union and the US. The Cold War space race never slowed down. The success of Venera 7 was a monumental achievement. It became the first space vehicle to send back messages from the surface of Venus, an accomplishment that had eluded NASA and other space organizations. It sent data for over 23 minutes before losing contact, which was a remarkable achievement, given the extreme conditions on the planet. This triumph was part of the USSR's broader strategy to showcase its supremacy in space exploration at a time when the US was focused on its moon missions. Nevertheless, the Soviet victories didn't come without their setbacks. While the Venera probes were vital for Venus exploration, they were also plagued with challenges. For example, the harsh conditions on Venus, its thick atmosphere, extreme heat and crushing pressure, made it difficult to maintain communication and keep the probes working for extended periods. Despite these difficulties, the Soviets continued their missions. Venera 9, launched in 1975, succeeded in sending back the first black and white pictures from the surface of Venus, further cementing the USSR's leadership in planetary exploration. The Soviet space program's work on Venus wasn't just about outshining the US. It was also about gathering essential scientific data. The Venera probes helped establish that Venus had a surface temperature of around 465 degrees Celsius, 869 degrees Fahrenheit. Extremely hot for any Earth-like life to exist. The probes also confirmed that the planet's atmosphere was primarily composed of carbon dioxide, with clouds of sulfuric acid, making it one of the most inhospitable places in the solar system. Despite this harsh environment, some scientists have continued to speculate about the possibility of life in Venus's upper cloud layers, where conditions may be more temperate. Recent discoveries, such as the detection of phosphine gas in Venus's atmosphere, have reignited interest in the planet. This has led to renewed efforts by space agencies like NASA, ESA, and Russia to launch new missions to Venus, as scientists seek to learn more about its history and whether life ever existed there. The Venera program, now largely forgotten in popular memory, was a pioneering effort that provided much of the first concrete data about Venus. The Soviet Union's commitment to these missions demonstrated their resolve in the space race and their technical achievements in planetary exploration. It laid the groundwork for future missions to both Venus and other planets. With the collapse of the USSR and the discontinuation of the Venera program, Venus exploration slowed down. NASA's focus shifted to Mars, and much of the academic community turned its attention elsewhere. However, as we look to the future, Venus may once again take center stage with new advancements and international collaboration. The secrets of this hostile planet may yet uncover more hidden truths, ones that could change our understanding of life in the universe. As the world of space exploration advances, Venus is once again capturing the attention of space agencies around the globe. Following decades of limited exploration, recent technological breakthroughs and scientific discoveries have reignited interest in the second planet from the Sun. While the Soviet Union's pioneering Venera program remains a monumental achievement in planetary exploration, Venus's extreme environment has posed significant challenges for continued missions. The atmosphere, composed mainly of carbon dioxide, along with clouds of sulfuric acid and crushing surface pressure, makes it an inhospitable world for human exploration and traditional robotic missions. However, new insights, such as the detection of phosphine in Venus's clouds in 2020, have sparked renewed scientific curiosity about the potential for microbial life in the planet's upper atmosphere. The discovery of phosphine, a gas typically associated with biological processes, raised the intriguing possibility that Venus could harbor life, albeit in its clouds, where conditions are less extreme than on the surface. This revelation has led to calls for further missions aimed at understanding the planet's complex atmosphere. With these new possibilities, space agencies, particularly NASA and ESA, European Space Agency, are now focusing on sending more advanced probes and landers to Venus, hoping to unlock new secrets. The upcoming missions, such as NASA's Veritas and Da Vinci Plus, aim to study Venus's surface and atmosphere in unprecedented detail, seeking to answer fundamental questions about the planet's geology, history, and the potential for past or present life. Additionally, international collaboration between space agencies is expected to increase as a result of these new efforts. By pooling resources and expertise, the global scientific community aims to make significant progress in understanding Venus's geological history and its potential to support life. Unlike the Cold War rivalry that once defined space exploration, today's missions to Venus are driven by a shared scientific curiosity and the need to answer questions that could have profound implications for humanity's understanding of life beyond Earth.